heavy, and it's certainly not going to be terribly high-tech. So I'm also going to try and make sure it's not actually a philosophy talk, but I should acknowledge two of my colleagues, Tim Bain and Josh Shepherd, who are philosophers and who I've talked to about some of the stuff I want to discuss this morning. But stupid stuff that I say is my fault and not their fault at all. Okay, so I want to talk to you about perception and sensation, as I say, in that order, although I have to say in that order because usually they're put in the other order, and it always amazes me that, every first-year psychology book about perception or sensation has the same title. They're all called sensation and perception. And perhaps the reason that they're put in that order is down to these guys, down to Aristotle and von Helmholtz, both of whom argued that we derive our percepts of the world from, if you like, raw sensation, perhaps by a process of unconscious inference. And I should just emphasize, okay, this is what Aristotle thought, it's what von Helmholtz thought. They're both people, Aristotle, you don't even have any real photos. Von Helmholtz, you only have black and white photos. Perhaps it's an opinion that's gone completely out of style. Worth noting that my friend Mark McCourt, who you can still get colour photos of, also believes that perception is derived from sensation. And what I'm going to argue in at least part of this talk is that that's not the case, that in fact things operate in the opposite order. I want to start with some definitions because I think one of the problems in discussing perception and sensation is that different people use the terms in very, very different ways. And if you talk to a philosopher about sensation and then you talk to a physiologist about sensation, they mean utterly different things. So I just want to start with some ordinary language definitions of terms. So an ordinary language definition of sensation is really, I think you ask the man or woman in the street, it's all that lovely, blooming, buzzing confusion. It's all that, those beautiful colours and shapes and so on that we see. I rather wish in the olden days of the internet, one of the things that was very popular was some setting that you could use to produce text that randomly changed in colour, flash, red and green and blue. And you can't get PowerPoint to do that, but I rather wish that I could have done that just to emphasise the nature of sensation. And I just need to, in parentheses, emphasize that this is my ordinary language definition of sensation, experience, phenomenology, the qualia elicited by stuff out there in the world. If you talk to a physiologist, a sensory physiologist, they mean something completely different by sensation. They tend to mean the biophysical cascade of events elicited by stimuli after they hit the sensory surface. And that's absolutely not what I mean. It's the opposite. So I'm going to use this ordinary language, qualia, phenomenology definition of sensation. So the experiences that are elicited by things in the outside world. And by perception, I'm going to take perception as the process through which we estimate the properties of things in the outside world. And perhaps an example, might help make this more concrete. So here are a couple of London buses. I believe there are things going on in London this morning. No idea what they are. Here are a couple of London buses, and one question I could ask you is about the material properties of the surfaces of those buses as objects out there in the world. So I could ask you, do you believe it's likely that those two buses are painted with the same make of red paint? And I don't know if you believe this, but if I look at those, I think, yeah, they probably are painted with the same red paint. So as a material property, as a property of an object out there in the world, I'd say that, in some senses, the color of those buses is identical, perceptually. On the other hand, if I ask you to look at the image and think about the experiences of red, so now red is the sensation that you have, there's all sorts of variation in my experience of red there. So here we've got a situation where the sensations elicited by the red paint on those two London buses is quite different, but I can make a perceptual judgment that the material colour, the surface colour of those two buses is the same. Everyone with me so far? Good, good. So, as I say, von Helmholtz, Aristotle, and so on, would suggest that, our ability to make that judgment about the paint that the buses are covered in, that perceptual judgment, they would argue that that's derived from sensation. Some process of inference of that distribution of sensations allows us to make a judgment about the surface colour, the material colour of the buses. I think an assumption that people often make, perhaps that von Helmholtz made, is that sensation in some sense corresponds pretty directly to what's happening in the sensory surface. So in terms of vision, and particularly in terms of colour, sensation, people have suggested, corresponds to what's going on in the photoreceptor array in the retina. And I just want to, first of all, put forward a couple of examples which I hope demonstrate to you that this is unlikely to be the case. So one is just a beautiful visual demonstration, not one of mine, one of Bo Lotto's and Dale Purvis's. So I want you to look at these two images, and they appear to be images of cubes which are covered in coloured tiles, and we appear to be looking at the cube on the left through a yellow filter, perhaps through yellow cellophane. We're looking at the cube on the right through blue cellophane, and I want you to look in particular at a couple of tiles. So I want you to look at this, let's see if I can get this thing to work. Yep, so this blue tile in the cube on the left, and this yellow tile in the cube on the right. And, people are happy with me describing the blue tile as a blue tile, and the yellow tile as a yellow tile. So they definitely are eliciting different sensations. One's eliciting a sensation of blueness, one's eliciting a sensation of yellowness. The interesting thing is that if I need to now move let's get rid of that. If I mask out the context, in fact, the light that's reaching your eyes from the pixels in those two images is identical. And so if we believe that the light that's hitting our retinae is, really, producing this initial activity in the sensory surface, it really seems implausible then to claim that our sensations correspond directly to whatever's going on in the sensory surface in the retinal array. There's and you can look again, and despite knowing that the light that's reaching your eyes from those two tiles is identical, you can't undo this. So that's a nice visual demonstration. You can do much fancier stuff, which in part proves the same point. So you can use a lovely thing like this, which is an adaptive optics setup, which is continuously measuring the imperfections, the distortions in the optics of the eye, and correcting for those imperfections. And by using a system like this, we can actually image individual photoreceptors in the living human retina. I've been in that particular setup. It's quite amazing. You can see your own cones. Moreover, you can, if you like, use the system in reverse, so you can project now tiny spots of light through the corrected optics of the eye and optically stimulate individual cones in the retina. And people have been doing this actually for quite a long time now. And one of the consistent results is that when one stimulates cones of a particular class, so let's say cones that have peak sensitivity to medium wavelength light, M cones, green cones, sometimes we call them, these sensations that are elicited, because you can actually experience something when a single cone is activated, provided you're dark adapted, the experiences that are elicited are not always green when you stimulate M cones, red when you stimulate L cones, blue when you stimulate S cones. In fact, if you just look at the distribution of experiences that are reported when different M cones, different, in inverted commas, green cones are stimulated in the retina, people actually report all sorts of different colors. So a relatively recent adaptive optics paper looking at stimulation of individual M cones, and the subjects report from different cones. There might be one M cone that elicits white sensations, another that elicits red sensations, another that elicits green sensations. So it really doesn't seem as if the sensation that we experience corresponds directly to activity in the retina, activity in the sensory surface. So we can now ask a question, well, what's affecting sensation beyond activity in the sensory surface? And now I want to, again, step backwards in time, not quite as far as Aristotle and von Helmholtz, but 1931, and a paper, in fact, a couple of, I think, really wonderful papers published by Robert Thulis from Glasgow in the British Journal of Psychology. And the title of these papers is Phenomenal Regression to the Real Object, and I'll explain what Thulis means by that. Here's a nice photo of Thulis. So what Thulis was doing was presenting people with real, he did a whole series of experiments, but let's say experiment one, he presented people with real three-dimensional objects seen from different viewpoints, and he asked his subjects to try and reproduce their experience. And in one version of the experiment, people are looking at a circular disk, a real physical circular disk, and they're looking at it from a particular oblique angle, and Thulis then asks his subjects to draw the foreshortened oval that they see. Even in 1931, there's some criticism of that people are lousy at drawing, and so he had another version where he gave people a disc on an axle, and they could adjust the orientation of the disc on the axle in a way, again, which was intended to reproduce the sensation elicited by their foreshortened view of a circular three-dimensional object. And here are the results that he obtained. So the dotted line on the outside is the, if you like, the real shape of that circular object. The black oval in the center is the veridical foreshortened perspective, and the other lines are depicting his data set. So this is data from over 100 observers. The middle of the black lines is the average shape that his observers report their sensation as being. The innermost line, which you see still doesn't correspond with the true foreshortened ellipse, is the closest anyone got to the truth, if you like. And the outer black line is, if you like, the worst that was produced. So here we've got a person who's trying to reproduce their sensation of a foreshortened disk, and in fact what they draw is pretty close to a perfect circle. I mean, there are various reasons why even that second version of the experiment, there are criticisms that can be laid at it. So a few years ago, I replicated Thulis with a design like this, where I show people, in this case, a lovely three-dimensional photograph of a mug with a circular rim, and then I use method of constant stimuli. I show them various ovals, and I ask them, is the oval too foreshortened or too circular? And I can plot a psychometric function. I can figure out what the point of subjective equality is. So there's the true foreshortened ellipse. There's the circular rim of the, if you like, the allocentric representation of the mug, and that's the point of subjective equality. And so what's going on, what Thulis argues, and I believe Thulis is right, is that our percept of that object as something which, in viewpoint independent terms, we represent as having a circular rim. The fact that we have that percept of the rim being circular actually influences our sensation and distorts our sensation away from the veridical projection towards what Thulis calls the real. So this is phenomenal regression to the real. Our phenomenal experience is actually biased towards our representation of the distal properties of the object. You can do the same kind of thing in color. So here's a stimulus I made a few years ago. You look at it, looks to me as if it's, again, one of these cubes, in this case covered with yellow tiles, red tiles, blue tiles, and green tiles. But of course, we're seeing the top surface under direct lighting and those two front surfaces under different degrees of shadow. And what I'd like you to do is just compare your sensations of those two yellow tiles. So one on the top surface in direct lighting, one on that side surface in shadow. To me, well, they certainly look different. The sensations elicited are different from one another. I'm also happy to report I believe they're made of the same yellow material, so the distal properties are identical. So think about the difference between those two tiles, and now look at those two patches. Do they look more different from one another than the two tiles? And for me, yeah, definitely. But of course, another of these lovely demos, that is that color, and that is that color in terms of the photons that are reaching your eyes. And so that seems to me another example of Thulis's phenomenal regression to the real. Our distal representation, our percept of those two tiles is that they're identical, and we see them, our sensations are more similar to one another, therefore, than they should be veridically, if you like, if sensation really was just what was going on at the sensory surface. Okay, so sensation, our experience, doesn't seem to be what's going on at the sensory surface, and it seems to be biased by our distal percepts. You might ask, well, what if we just kept going with the bias, and what if, in fact, our sensations really just corresponded to our distal percepts? So if we think about the distal percept of colour, so I've got, again, let me see if I can just get that out of the way, a blue cube and a red sphere, and the cube appears to be made of a uniform red material to me. The sphere, the faces of the sphere are all of the cube all appear to be made of the same blue material. And so you can ask yourself, well, okay, what would the world be like if regression to the real was taken all the way, and so my sensations actually corresponded to, in this case, my distal percepts of colour. And if we do that, we discover that we actually throw away all sorts of other useful bits of information which are informing us about the world. So if we just represent distal colour, we throw away shape from shading, and we lose the three-dimensionality. If we thought about something similar in the object shape domain, if we just represented an allocentric version of objects that we saw in the world, we would lose information about our viewpoint relative to those objects in the world. So sensation seems to be something that certainly isn't simply corresponding directly to activity in the sensory surface, but it's also not simply, it's not a replication of perception. So something active is going on here, and sensation seems to be retaining information then from multiple distal properties, so colour, lighting, allocentric shape, viewpoint. And the interesting thing is that those properties are actually weighted differently from the way in which, if you like, they're weighted in the raw signal in the sensory surface. So sensation definitely seems to be something that's being constructed, and it's something that's, according to these demos at least, it really seems to be something that's being constructed from our estimation of distal properties. So it looks as if here sensation is something that is following our estimation of distal properties. Sensation is following perception. If that's the case, then we might ask the question, well, okay, is perception then independent of sensation? If sensation is something that happens later, can we show that we've estimated distal properties of things out there in the world independent of having an experience? Does perception actually occur in the absence of sensation? So I think this might be the only proper experiment I'm going to describe in this talk. An oldish study where Liam Norman, Charlie Hayward, Kathleen Akins, and I tried to test this question. So we were asking this question, is there any evidence that we have computed distal properties of stimuli in the absence of sensation? And so this is all done in the colour domain, and so what I'm interested in, the question that we're really asking is there evidence that the visual system has computed distal colour, so lighting independent colour, material colour? Is there evidence that the visual system has computed that, so has done colour constancy, if you like, in the absence of sensation? So is there colour constancy for unseen colours? And the first thing that we have to do is come up with a method of presenting stimuli which are unseen. And to do that, we use meta-contrast masking. Here's the basic sequence of stimuli. We have a blank screen. Then, for a very short duration, we have a colored disk presented, 10, 20, 30 milliseconds, something like that. We have a short delay after the offset of the disk, again, typically something like 20 milliseconds, and then we present a ring, and the inner contour of the ring corresponds spatially with the outer contour of the disk. And so you can do meta-contrast masking where the disks and the rings are, bright and dark and so on, but particularly if you do all of this at equiluminance, so the gray background, the pinkish and rather desaturated disk, and the greenish and rather desaturated ring are all equiluminant, then you get really terrific masking. When I was programming this, I really thought something had gone wrong, and I had to really double check that the disk was actually there, because at equiluminance with the right timing, you really can't see the disk. The interesting thing, though, is, okay, so we can make the disk invisible, but we can show that the disk, information from the disk is still being processed by the visual system, because we can show that the disk still operates as a prime. So if I ask you to make a decision about the color of the ring, is the ring greenish or reddish, if the disk matches the ring in color, then you are faster to make a decision. So you may not see the disk, but we've got good evidence that it's still being processed by the visual system. So I've said if the disk and the ring match in color, then that speeds your decision. But what do we mean by matching here? So is the priming here optimal when the disk and the ring match in terms of the light that reaches your eyes, and so the initial activation in the sensory surface, or is the prime most effective when the disk and the ring match in terms of their distal color properties, so their properties as surface materials out there in the world? And as I've shown you, we can't tease those two potential answers apart. What we have to do to address this question is actually change the illumination between the presentation of the disk and the presentation of the ring. And so now we can actually compare the effectiveness of spectral matches between the prime and the target, and distal surface material, if you like, perceptual matches between the prime and the target. And so the display that we use is something like this. So it's quite a subtle slide, but they were also quite subtle stimuli. So if you look carefully, you can see we've got this nice multicolored background. We've got, okay, so there's my disk, gap, ring. But the other thing I want you to notice is that there's a subtle boundary at an angle across the display. So it's as if, lost my pointer. So the lower half of the display is under slightly bluish light, under skylight, and the upper part of the display is under slightly yellowish light, under sunlight. And that boundary moves quite rapidly in real time as we're presenting the stimuli. And so, again, lost my pointer. The disk is being presented here under sunlight, but by the time the ring is presented, shadow boundary has moved, and so the ring is being presented under skylight. And we have, after probably literally months of tweaking things, we have managed to come up with some stimulus colors in which most people will report this color under skylight as looking greenish, and they'll report it under sunlight as looking bluish. And so we can just ask people to make a blue-green color discrimination. And we can present, as I say, a ring that either matches our prime in spectral terms or in perceptual terms. So a surface match, a material match, a perceptual match, or just a match in the spectral composition of the light. And we can look at the effectiveness of the prime for those two conditions. So how much is reaction time speeded when we actually present a prime rather than there being a prime absent. And what we find is that the effect of a prime is much larger when we have a match between prime and target in terms of their distal properties, their surface properties, than when they match in terms of the spectral composition of light that reaches your eyes from them. So it really looks as if what's happening is that a match for the visual system here is a match in distal properties, in the properties, the apparent material properties of things out there in the world. Which is surprising, perhaps, but not what we were expecting, but a cool result. So it really does look as if here an unseen stimulus is priming in terms of its distal properties. So the visual system must have computed those distal properties in the absence of experience, in the absence of sensation, because you can't see the disk. People might worry, okay, can you really not see the disk? So our subjects, this is quite a lengthy and horrible experiment for them, our subjects were subject to yet another lengthy and horrible experiment where the stimuli are all the same, but now we're asking them just to make a decision about whether or not there's a prime present, and in fact to give us an estimate of their confidence. So we can do some signal detection theory, and we can do it with two different prime durations, both of which were effective in terms of priming from the unseen disk. And you can see for the short duration, d prime is not different from 0. For the slightly longer duration, for most subjects, in fact, d prime would not be different from 0, but there are at least a few subjects where we get data which at least allow us to test whether we're conforming to the assumptions of signal detection theory. As d prime's not significantly different from 0 for the short duration prime, and yet the short duration prime is priming in terms of its distal properties, I think that's a good demonstration of color constancy for an unseen surface. And I think, as we rather brazenly say somewhere in the paper, what we've shown is that Aristotle and von Helmholtz are wrong. Maybe taking it a bit far. Okay, so I think that's the end of the concrete part of the talk, and now we're going to get a bit more speculative. And I just want to say a few other things about the properties of sensation, which I then want to use to ask some questions about what on earth sensation might be for. So one thing that I think is interesting about sensation is that it seems to be far from immediate, and there are various ways that this has been demonstrated. A lovely demonstration is the so-called cutaneous rabbit. So if I take someone and while they're looking away, I tap them twice in succession at this point on their arm, and then with an identical delay up here at a remote point on their arm. The sensation that they report is not of 2 taps here followed by 1 tap there, but rather of 3 taps equally spaced up the arm. And one might ask, well, how does this come about? And in particular, how can stimulation at the 3rd point actually change the locus, the location of experience of the 2nd tap before the 3rd tap has happened? So if there is no 3rd tap, all I feel are 2 taps at the veridical location. If there's a 3rd tap, I get this cutaneous rabbit illusion. And that seems very hard to explain initially, but it's in fact trivial to explain if we accept that sensation is something that takes rather a long time to elicit, and in fact all of the taps have actually happened before we experience those sensations on our arm. And the cutaneous rabbit suggests that in that context, sensations delayed from the stimulus, so there's a lag of about half a second. There's a lovely paper by Claire Sargent from 2012 with a commentary by me saying various things about it, showing something similar in the visual domain, so showing that a stimulus which is somewhere near the threshold of experience, so a stimulus which would otherwise be unseen, can be brought into consciousness if it's cued, and it can be brought into consciousness if it's cued in the, if you like, the typical way. So if we have a cue indicating the likely location of the target a few hundred milliseconds before the target is presented. But interestingly, a post-cue is also effective. So a cue presented 500 milliseconds, 400 milliseconds after the presentation of this just subthreshold stimulus also brings it into awareness. And again, what this is implying is that sensation is really somewhat lagged, relative to the stimulus that's eliciting the sensation. It's taking half a second or so for the sensation to be elicited, both in the tactile domain and in the visual domain. There's just a bit more of Claire's data. So, some interim conclusions. Perception isn't derived from sensation. Interestingly, sensation is influenced by perception. Perception is not necessarily conscious, and in fact, one might suggest that in fact that perception is never conscious in the sense of necessarily being something we can report on. Perhaps all we can report on is the sensory the sensory experience that accompanies perception. And then the other thing is that, okay, this delay appears to suggest that relying on sensation to drive your behavior, to drive your immediate responses to something out there in the world that, might be very good for you or might be very bad for you, relying on sensation that has this delay and, in fact, which is not our best estimate of the true distal properties of the object, that would be a lousy thing to do. But sensation nevertheless appears to be actively constructed. So it's not just what's going on at the sensory surface. The visual system's actually adjusted things. And so that really suggests to me that sensation must have some kind of function. But what on earth could it be for? Because it's not our best veridical estimate of properties in the outside world, and it's also delayed relative to perception. So, if we're faced with something like this, it would be pretty suboptimal to rely on the sensation that's elicited by the tiger when we're trying to make a quick decision about what to do. So this is the final bit, and it's very speculative, and it involves me talking about things of which I know very little. So this is really the bit where I'm hoping for help. So is the delay a problem? Is there any use to sensation? Well, certainly the delay is a problem if we think we're going to use sensation to drive our immediate behavioral responses to things out there in the world. But sensation might nevertheless be useful in the longer term. So one speculation that we could make is that, perhaps the nature of our sensations, the properties of sensation, aren't particularly tuned for driving immediate behavioral responses. Perhaps they're much more useful for remembering what went on in a particular situation. And this is where I need help, because I know a fair bit about colour and colour constancy and so on and so forth, consciousness, but I know precious little about memory and episodic memory. But what I'm suggesting here is that perhaps there's a role for sensation as actually being the basis of our episodic memories. So, we might want to remember where we saw the tiger, where it was hiding, how dark the shadows were, and maybe even, the identity of the tiger. Is it a particularly orange one? Those biases in sensation, so the way in which sensations don't correspond to distal percepts, I wonder potentially if those are useful. So if we bias our sensations so that, if remembering the way in which the undergrowth casts shadows on the body of the tiger is particularly important to us, we might bias our sensation so that we are, if you like, accentuating the effects of shading rather than accentuating the effects of surface colour. So is that a useful kind of thing to do? Potentially it is. I don't know what the answer is. Is the delay of sensation something useful? So if we're actually remembering our sensations and they're occurring after we've at least started initiating actions, then we can remember both the sensation and the action that accompanied it, perhaps even the outcome that accompanied it. Sensation, my sensation of the world is that it's apparently complete and equally detailed, and of course, in terms of perceptual information that's available to me, this is not true. I only have really good perceptual information from parts of the world that have been subject to direct gaze, and that's going to be not most of it. And in fact, that distribution of gaze is going to differ between different circumstances. So the distribution of gaze might actually be irrelevant in helping me figure out something that happened in the past that would be useful to think about, so retrieving an episodic memory. Perhaps it is easier to retrieve an appropriate episodic memory if I suppress the differences that different gaze patterns elicit. So perhaps the illusion of completeness is helpful in terms of retrieving appropriate episodic memories. So here are those questions, and as I say, I'm not a memory expert. I'm hoping you lot are. And so, perhaps people have already answered these questions. If they have, do tell. As they say on the BBC, answers on a postcard, please, or just tell me now. So, thank you.
Thank you, Bob. So while you were talking, I was wondering about the evolution of this distinction, especially now that you want to tie it to episodic memory and recall. So is this something that's only about us, or do you think monkeys, dogs, rats? I mean, where did this come about?
Ooh, that's a lovely question, and I suspect, like many of these questions, I won't know the answer, but that would be a really terrific thing to go and look for. And I imagine that there is data out there that would allow me to address that question. So I imagine that there is data out there which we could use to distinguish between responses to sensation and responses to distal percepts in non-human animals. And I'd be very surprised if that distinction wasn't found in a whole variety of non-human animals. I mean, we know that all manner of non-human animals actually compute distal percepts appropriately. All sorts of things have color constancy, jumping spiders, bees, all sorts of mammals. The question then is, do they also have sensation? So can we demonstrate that there, if you like, that there are two versions of the world that they have, which we and they can tap into under different circumstances? So fantastic question. As I say, I don't know the answer to many of those things, but in a way, what I'm looking for in this discussion are, questions like that, suggestions like that, where I think we should go and actually find out. Do you know the answer? No. No. Anyone?
Part of it, I guess, has to do with how strongly you want to tie sensation with consciousness. And then what do we mean by, what do you mean by consciousness in this case? So that's what...
Yeah, so I'm really meaning phenomenal consciousness, as opposed to, if you like, a more propositional consciousness where, I can be perfectly conscious of my decision that the paint on those two buses matches, but I can couch that in propositional terms rather than in phenomenal terms. So it gets tricky in terms of what you mean by consciousness as well.
But so maybe one way to look at it is to look at those species that we have the best evidence for something that looks like episodic memory.
Yeah. So probably primates more than rats. Maybe rats, maybe not rats. Primates good.
Maybe crows.
Maybe crows, yeah.
So there was a question over here. Yes, and then George.
Hi, thanks for your talk. It was very, very cool. So I'm not sure I'm on the right path here, but so if sensation is derived from perception, but also perception is affected by cognition, or there is an open debate there, but there is this idea of the conceptual penetration of perception, then at what point in the process we have a true representation of the reality, if we ever do?
So could you just repeat the last part?
At what point in the information processing we have a true representation of the reality, if we ever do it?
If we ever have it, I suspect perceptually we have a representation of reality which is as good as we can get given the information available to us, but there's never sufficient information available to us. So our percepts are always potentially inaccurate. So there's no reason to believe that we ever have truly veridical percepts of the properties of things out there in the world. But we can get quite close. Is that the answer?
George?
Hi, Bob. Thank you. The question is very similar to Liuba's. So we're going to change the books such that now it's perception and sensation, but then there might be something missing, which is what is before perception. I mean, distal properties are not there in the visual stimulus. So what should we call that? What is the process that leads us to that?
So what your sensory physiologist would call sensation definitely exists. I'm not denying that, there is a pattern of activity in the retina, in the sensory surface. I'm not denying that we start with that information, and we probably combine that information with contextual information that we have either acquired before in the immediate past or in the distant past. So again, it's one of these issues where defining your terms is terribly important. I'm not denying that the sensory physiologist's version of sensation exists. Of course it exists. We can measure it. We know there are these things going on. So we know there's that information there. I'm just emphasizing that that pattern of information that may be, the starting point for perception isn't experience. So the information absolutely is there, but it doesn't correspond to phenomenal experience.
Over there. Pass it on.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Just relating to some questions that have been asked already, like if we define sensation as experience, qualia, phenomenal consciousness, then by this line of reasoning, we should follow it like from this Nagel work that it is something like to be a bat, for example, or a given individual. Then if we follow this line of reasoning, we should apply sensation or experience, we can, I think, use these terms interchangeably, to every animal, basically, or to even more fundamental.
Well, maybe not to every animal. So, there may be, there may not be terribly, heated arguments about there being something it's like to be a bat, but there probably are going to be pretty heated arguments with people if I argue that there's something it's like to be a jumping spider. So we're coming back to Alex's question, which is really a question, is there evidence for sensation, just within the human species, in a fairly limited range of species, or in many, many species? Can we use evidence for there being a difference between sensation and perception, perhaps as a route in to addressing the question of whether there is something it is like to be an X?
So in this sense, there is no difference between sensation and perception, for example, assuming that in jumping spiders?
So I think there's pretty good evidence that jumping spiders estimate the distal properties of things out there in the world. Jumping spiders have color constancy, or at least some species of jumping spider have color constancy. They have terrific allocentric representations of the shape of the world. But we don't know whether that's actually accompanied by a jumping spider sensation. And so that seems to me, a critical question to address, and something, it may not be easy, but it's something that's empirically addressable. So for humans and primates, I think it would be, relatively straightforward to show, if you like, there are two different versions of their representation of stuff in the outside world, a perceptual one and a phenomenal one. But perhaps for jumping spiders, all they have is the perceptual one.
Okay, so for vertebrates, I think just one word here, subjective construal for experience of the world. It is term used in social science, and it would be answer your question.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. You know, you mentioned briefly, I think, that we use sort of predicted sensation for the purpose of action. But I wondered if, or maybe you didn't, and maybe that's me filling in.
I think we're most likely to use percepts for driving action.
Okay, so so I actually would kind of want to flesh that out a little, because in the engineering and motor control world, there's this thing called the forward model. And in humans and primates, it's computed in the cerebellum, probably in other vertebrates too. And I think that what this does, and what you see when you don't have a cerebellum, is you have this really poor motor control, because you're kind of lagging. You're trying to correct for things, and you're too late because sensation is too slow. So it's the predicted sensory consequences of your motor command. And I just wondered what you thought about whether that kind of framework might be helpful for you and might help us answer some of these questions about where do we draw the line, how low can you go? I would argue that all animals do this. They predict the sensory consequences because sensation lags. And that's the basis possibly for conscious experience.
So I guess the interesting, so to my mind, this is thinking on my feet, but you say, we have this excellent forward model that allows us to control behavior with great accuracy. If we delete the cerebellum, then we still produce behaviors which may be sort of appropriate, but they are very rough and ready, and they're very delayed. So I wonder if you had a species that didn't have sensation, if you could do the equivalent of deleting the cerebellum, rather than seeing an organism which can still respond, but it now responds rather slowly and rather inaccurately, if instead of that you just ended up with an organism that could not respond at all. So if you didn't have this rather laggard sensation, if you deleted the availability of, if you like, the perceptual forward model, you'd be left with nothing, whereas, at least for us, you're still left with your delayed and not optimally veridical sensation to drive behavior, but now to drive it in a rather inaccurate and sluggish fashion.
I think I just was trying to make the suggestion that this kind of framework, when you're asking sort of what is the basis for consciousness, conscious awareness, that predicted sensation could be the basis for, could be what you're looking for.
Yeah.
That's all. Thanks.
Brad?
So I kind of had the sense that something in what you're saying kind of rhymes with Polishion's notion of tacit knowledge. And I'm curious about, when you put people in this kind of a psychophysical task and you ask them to respond on the basis of what they see, if you kind of put them in a particular stance with respect to perception and sensation, and I'm curious if there's ways to get them out of that stance, maybe in the context of patients with certain kinds of low-level impairments.
Or just in terms of, perhaps comparing tasks which are sort of overlearnt into automaticity with tasks that still require some active control, so actions versus habits. Perhaps habits are responses, so habitual responses in the actions versus habits sense of habitual. Perhaps those are driven purely by not necessarily conscious percepts of what's going on in the world, whereas in the action phase of things, perhaps you are more reliant on sensation. Is that the kind of thing that you're getting at?
it's not exactly clear to me, but I'm just curious if, you ask people to essentially report what they see as opposed to asking them what's there. And I'm not saying that you can switch back and forth between the two, but if the act of being in a particular stance with respect to your experience pushes your judgment sort of deeper into the system, it pushes it toward your experience rather than toward what your body thinks is there.
That's one possibility. I mean, the other possibility is that task set, so what's important to you in a given task, might actually determine, the way in which, the relative importance, the relative biases of things like surface color versus illumination conditions might actually change the way in which you bias those in generating a sensation. So again, going back to the tiger, it might be particularly important to me to actually understand the way in which the shadow in undergrowth can camouflage a tiger, and that might be much more important to me than being able to remember the particular color of orange of the tiger's coat. And so there may be circumstances there where what's important to remember, and perhaps also what's important to experience, is, in that context, biased towards emphasizing the consequences of shadows, whereas in most circumstances where we're asking people questions about color, what's important to us is actually to eliminate the effects of shadows. So I wonder if, rather than thinking about these things as ways of distinguishing between percepts and sensations, percepts and experiences, perhaps rather task set is going to change the nature of the experiences, is going to change the relative contributions of surface color, shadows, and so on.
Alfonso. And then a question back there, and then audience.
Thank you, Bob. I'm going to ask a question that reflects my confusion. Is the fundamental issue that you're dealing with then the question of granularity? Because you have definitionally created a situation where perception, the way you define it, has a level of analysis that doesn't correspond to the units of conscious perception, of conscious awareness. Whereas the way you define sensation essentially is the grain of which it is of those kinds of units of reality that we can perceive, we can understand, and capture. So is the issue then merely definitional, or is there, so that it helps solve your problem of the delay, for example. If in fact it is a matter of granularity, then the delay is necessary to integrate of a space, of a time, and so on. Is it clear what I'm asking?
Can you flesh it out slightly?
Well, it seems to me that the way in which you've defined these terms is based on an assumption of granularity differences, right? So perception is the stuff that is amorphous, is out there, and then the stuff that you call sensation is a vocabulary, is a grain that is commensurate with the kinds of things we can be aware of, the kinds of things that we can perceive, the kinds of things we can talk about, the kind of things which we can act upon. And if that were the case, then it is really a definitional distinction that you're making. And so it would not be surprising that it has these properties, because it is so by definition.
But my supposition is that my position is that it's more than definitional. So that in fact you can act on perception, you can act on unconscious perception. You can also act on sensation, but you're going to do it in different ways because they are emphasizing information in different ways.
Right, but the way in which perception is being cashed out in this articulation is as the response of your retina, whatever it is, to this physical stuff. It becomes it only has the status of something to which you can react to once it achieves a level of granularity that is appropriate for mentation or whatever you want to call it.
Sorry, long delay while I try and think about. Yeah. Does that depend then on whether there's evidence for responses to unseen properties, for responses to properties of which we have no awareness, no consciousness. And my answer would be that there's plenty of evidence that we respond to stimuli, we respond to properties that we have computed, but of which we have no awareness. And so we can either respond to properties of which we have no awareness. We might be responding very rapidly and very automatically to our distal estimates of what's going on in the world, or we might be responding much more slowly and perhaps much more reflectively on sensations, on things to which we do have conscious access.
Although I don't require for this account to require reflection. It could be just a basic vocabulary that we as a species have for being able to interpret the world. So I can perceive something as, say, a line or a color or whatever it is, and it is the composition of those elements, the grain of analysis, that is determining the delay and is determining the possibility of having an effect on behavior.
Maybe it's only the grain of analysis in terms of what we then do, if you like, with the distal unconscious components of the visual process, how we then recombine them. And we can recombine them in different ways. And I guess I'm saying that in the sense, so sensation is a recombination of those unconscious distal properties, and perhaps how complex that recombination is will determine things like how rapidly those kinds of experience are available to us, and how rapidly we can use sensation to respond to things in the world, as opposed to those disparate distal components. So I guess one of the other things that I didn't discuss was the extent to which sensations actually are bound. We've got all of these distal properties that we have separately computed, and we're rebinding them in sensation, whereas those unconscious percepts, we have unconscious percepts of surface color, of lighting conditions, of allocentric shape, of viewpoint, but they're all separate from one another. Am I going along the right lines? No, we can talk. Let's talk about it.
In psychophysics and experimental psychology, we always focus on performance, how accurate we were in estimating what was the distal percept, for instance. However, this is not the only thing we do. There is a whole metacognitive dimension that we apply to perception, so how confident I was to what I was perceiving. Was that really a tiger? Is the doctor that is telling me that specific diagnosis, is this really what I heard? Now, my question is, do you think that this additional, difficult to measure, of course, metacognitive dimension of how confident I am in what is my distal percept may have something to do with this role of sensation? So is that a way of rating how much I'm actually confident about the thing I've perceived?
Yes, that's a great question, and I've certainly had discussions with Kathleen Akins, who is our philosophical collaborator, back then on whether it's only possible for you to, for example, make a judgment that a chair is painted in that particular colonial blue, so not a rough and ready colour constancy, not a rough and ready distal estimate, but now a really, really precise distal estimate. There is this one very specific blue, and I'm trying to figure out whether or not the chair is painted in that very specific blue. And I think I agree with her that that much more demanding task of estimating what's going on out there in the world probably is something that requires sensation, so that requires conscious reflection. So if you're given a very difficult task about the nature of things in the world, the distal nature of things in the world, then I suspect that to be confident in making those really difficult distal judgments, you probably really do need sensation. Whereas in order to make a simpler distal judgment, were those two London buses painted with the same kind of red paint, you're unlikely to actually need phenomenal experience. So you can be confident in easy distal judgments in the absence of sensation, but really difficult distal judgments probably are something that relies on the sensation, and perhaps because in those really difficult distal judgments, the task has specified which other aspects, which other distal estimates of what's going on in the world we really need to discard and ignore. So the extent to which we actually have task demands that specify, if you like, the combination of distal properties that are going to be important to us. When we have task demands that are specifying things like that, then perhaps it's the sensation in which a particular combination of distal properties is necessary. It's then that reflecting on sensation becomes important, because sensation becomes tuned to the task at hand. Is that a sort of answer?
I have a question on the delay of sensation that is kind of related to Laura's point. So we live in a highly dynamic world, no? So things unfold slowly and are therefore predictable. So, and I was wondering, so does this eliminate the delay of sensation, and is therefore perhaps this delay actually more the exception than the rule?
I suspect the delay is always going to be there. It's the extent to which the delay impacts on our ability to behave optimally in the world. So if we're living in a predictable world, then the delay becomes much less important to us than if we're living in an extremely unpredictable world where things may change dramatically over the course of half a second. So my guess would be that the delay is always going to be there, but the impact of the delay is going to depend on the predictability of the context.
There's one last question back there, and then we'll break. Keep it short, and a short answer.
The short answer is probably, I don't know.
Yeah, thanks for this really fascinating talk. So you posed this question whether, so what purpose there could be to still experience something with a delay, right? And one answer that you thought could be possible is to say, okay, that purpose is memory, to remember the situation. And I think you kind of said it already, but what do you think if you could we go one step further and say the purpose is actually to adjust behavior to a certain situation? Actually, not just memory, but adjusting behavior for the next time that this situation occurs. Yeah.
So I guess my thought is that having a memory which we can match reasonably easily with current circumstances is what's going to allow us to adjust behavior.
Answer.
All
It
right,
was a short answer, perfect.
Thank you very much, Bob. Before you leave, remember, you have to be back here at 11:20.